In my 40 years on the bench, I've seen people come into my courtroom at their lowest moments, scared, ashamed, sometimes even grateful for a second chance. But every so often, someone walks in with something far more dangerous than anger: entitlement. This case stayed with me because the defendant didn't just disrespect the court. She put her hands on a court officer and acted like money could erase it. Let me tell you what happened and why the lesson mattered. When this case landed on my desk, it came with a thick file and a short summary that told me enough to take it seriously: assault in a courthouse, disorderly conduct, and interference with court operations. You don't see that every day because most people, no matter how upset, understand that a courthouse is not a place to test boundaries. The defendant was a woman in her early 30s. The report described her as the wife of a billionaire financier, someone used to being accommodated, used to having doors opened, used to hearing yes when the answer should have been no. The incident involved one of my bailiffs, a steady professional who'd worked many courtrooms. He wasn't a man looking for conflict. He was a man doing what court officers do: keeping order, keeping people safe, moving the calendar along so everyone, defendants, victims, families, can have their day in court. What concerned me most wasn't just the allegation of physical contact. It was the pattern described in the statements: escalating defiance, repeated refusals to follow lawful directions, and a final moment where she crossed the line from disrespect into violence. I remember thinking, Frank, this isn't about status. This is about whether the courthouse still means something. Because if people can intimidate court officers, the entire system starts to wobble. Here's what happened that day, as I learned it from the reports, said statements, and the video. It was a busy morning, one of those calendars where every seat matters and every minute matters. The defendant had come to court on a separate matter, a traffic-related hearing connected to a vehicle registered under a business entity. Now, people show up for traffic court annoyed all the time. They feel inconvenienced, they feel singled out, they feel like the rules should bend for them. But the courthouse is one of the few places left where the rules don't bend for your resume. According to witnesses, she arrived late, and she arrived loud. Not loud in the way a nervous person can be loud, talking too much because they're afraid. Loud in a different way, commanding, dismissive, like everyone around her was staff. The security desk asked her to step aside to complete routine screening. She refused at first, then she complied, but with a performance: complaints, insults, eye rolls. A bailiff approached and said, politely and clearly, that she needed to lower her voice and follow instructions because proceedings were underway. And this is where it turned. According to multiple statements, she leaned in and said something to the effect of, "You can't tell me what to do, and I'll have you fired." Then she tried to walk past the screening point toward the courtroom hallway. Now, in any courthouse, that's not acceptable. We have protocols for a reason. People have restraining orders. People have volatile family situations. Some people show up angry enough to do something they can't take back. The first job of the courthouse is safety. The bailiff stepped in, not aggressively, not dramatically, just placed himself between her and the secured hallway and instructed her to stop. The video showed what happened next. She raised her hand and struck him across the upper chest and shoulder area, hard enough that you could see the officer's body shift back a half step. It wasn't a tap, it wasn't an accident, it was an assault. When I watched that footage, I felt that heavy feeling I've felt many times over the years: disappointment, not just in her behavior, but in what it represents. Because a courthouse is where people come to resolve conflict with words and law, not fists. And what struck me most was how quickly she tried to reclaim control afterward, pointing, gesturing, barking orders, acting like she was still the authority in the room. I've been doing this long enough to know when someone believes consequences are for other people, the court has to be very clear. As I continued reviewing the evidence, the case became less about one strike and more about a whole chain of choices. The officer's report documented red marks and soreness. The medical note wasn't dramatic, but it didn't need to be. In court, we don't measure wrongdoing only by hospital visits. We measure it by intent, by risk, by the message it sends. I read statements from courthouse staff who were working that day. They described a woman who treated instructions like suggestions. One clerk wrote that the defendant was smirking as she argued, as if the situation was amusing. Then I reviewed the security audio transcript, and what I saw, what bothered me, was how many off-ramps she had. She had multiple moments where she could have paused, taken a breath, and said, "I'm sorry, I'm stressed, I'll cooperate." Instead, she chose escalation, and after the incident she didn't calm down, she doubled down. She allegedly demanded names, threatened complaints, and insisted that she would make this disappear. Let me tell you something I've learned. The court can work with fear, with confusion, even with anger. What the court cannot tolerate is intimidation. When intimidation enters, justice leaves. By the time law enforcement was notified for the courthouse incident report, the defendant had already created a scene that disrupted other cases, people who had nothing to do with her. Elderly defendants waiting patiently, working people who took time off their jobs, parents with kids, everyone forced to sit there while one person tried to dominate the room. That matters to me, because court isn't theater. Court is where real people come because something in life has gone wrong and they need it made right. By the time this case came to my courtroom, it had picked up attention outside the courthouse, not because anyone was looking for entertainment, but because someone had recorded part of the outburst on a phone after the initial contact, and snippets made their way online. My staff mentioned it to me. "Judge, people are talking about this one." They told me there were comments, arguments, hot takes. Some people wanted the harshest outcome possible. Some people, as always, said it was being overblown. But here's what I tell my clerks, and here's what I believe. It doesn't matter if 8 people saw it or 8 million. In my courtroom, everyone gets the same fair process. I don't sentence based on trends. I don't rule based on outrage. I rule based on evidence, the law, and the person standing in front of me. Still, I'm not naive. I know that public attention can affect how people behave. Some defendants show up trying to perform for the internet. Some show up thinking their followers will shield them from accountability. And I've had to say this more times than I can count. Social media is not a courtroom, and likes are not a legal defense. When the defendant walked into my courtroom, I noticed 2 things immediately. First, she was dressed impeccably, expensive jacket, perfect hair, the kind of presentation that tells you she's used to being seen a certain way. Second, her posture, upright chin, slow steps, scanning the room like she was evaluating it. I've had wealthy defendants. I've had famous defendants. I've had powerful defendants. I treat them the same as everyone else, but I can usually tell in the first 30 seconds whether someone is there to learn or there to win a contest. I looked at her and said, "Good morning, ma'am. Please step forward. State your name for the record." She gave it, and it came out clipped, like she was annoyed to be required to speak. I said, "You're here today on a charge of assault on a court officer and related conduct. Do you understand why you're here?" She responded, "Yes, and it's ridiculous." I didn't raise my voice. I never need to. I said, "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to choose your words carefully. This court is not ridiculous. The process is serious, and an allegation of assault is serious." She gave a half shrug and said, "He got in my way." I leaned forward slightly. "He didn't get in your way. He was doing his job. In a courthouse, that's not optional." Her attorney stood up, polite and professional, and asked to speak. I allowed it. The attorney explained that his client had been under stress, that there was confusion at the security area, and that she did not intend to harm anyone. I listened. I always listen. Then I said, "Counsel, stress does not excuse striking an officer. Confusion does not justify physical contact. Let's proceed with the evidence." We played the video. I watched her face while it played. Sometimes when people see themselves on a screen, really see themselves, they feel shame, they look away, they soften, they understand. She didn't. The video showed the bailiff stepping in, arms down, body positioned to block the hallway. It showed her moving forward. It showed her hand come up and strike him. I paused the footage at the moment of contact. I said, "Ma'am, is that your hand?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Is that you making contact with a court officer?" She said, "Yes, but..." I held up my hand gently, not to silence her, but to slow the pace. "No but yet. Answer the question. Did you strike him?" She exhaled and said, "Yes." I said, "All right, now explain." She said, "He was being aggressive." I turned slightly toward the officer, who was seated to the side, composed, in uniform. "Officer, did you put your hands on her at any point before the strike?" He answered calmly, "No, Your Honor." I looked back at her. The video doesn't show him being aggressive. The video shows him standing still, preventing entry to a restricted area. That's his responsibility. She rolled her eyes. That eye roll, people might think it's small. It isn't, because it tells you where the person is mentally. It says, "This is beneath me." I took a breath. "Ma'am, let me tell you something. In this courtroom, I don't care what neighborhood you live in, what your husband does for a living, what car you drive, or what your last name is. You put your hands on a court officer, you've crossed a line." She looked at me and said, "This is being blown out of proportion." I said, "No, it's being treated in proportion to what it represents." Then my bailiff approached the bench and handed the clerk something. The clerk leaned in and quietly explained. It was information related to the defendant's conduct after the incident, posts and messages. Now, I want to be careful here because courts don't sentence people for opinions. But when someone is actively undermining proceedings, mocking the process, and demonstrating ongoing contempt, it becomes relevant to attitude and rehabilitation. I said, "Ma'am, were you using your phone during the court process previously, including while this case was pending?" She said, "I don't know what you mean." I said, "I mean exactly what I asked. Did you post about this case?" Her attorney shifted uncomfortably. She said, "Maybe. So what?" I nodded slowly. "So what is this? The court has been shown a post attributed to you referring to these proceedings as literally nothing and calling me dramatic." Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second. Then she recovered and said, "It's a joke." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "Let me tell you what's not a joke. A courthouse is where people go when their lives are falling apart. Divorce, eviction, criminal charges, victims seeking protection. You don't get to turn it into content." She laughed. Actually laughed. Quietly, under her breath. I felt a sadness more than anger. Because when you've been on the bench as long as I have, you realize this isn't just arrogance. It's immaturity mixed with power. And that combination can hurt people. I said, "Ma'am, I want you to listen carefully. Respect is not a gift you give when you feel like it. Respect is the entry fee for being part of a civilized society." She crossed her arms. I said, "You had choices that day. You could have complied. You could have apologized. You could have shown humility. Instead, you chose force. And then you chose mockery." At that point, I turned to the assaulted officer. "Officer, would you like to address the court?" He stood. He didn't rant. He didn't exaggerate. He said, "Your Honor, I've worked here a long time. I've been cursed at. I've been threatened. But being struck in my workplace, where I'm trying to keep everyone safe, it was humiliating. My kids saw the clip online. That was hard. That line, my kids saw the clip. It hit me. I looked at her again and said, "Do you hear what he just said? This isn't just about you and him. It's about what you did to his family, to his dignity, to the sense of safety in this building." She said, "I didn't mean for it to go online." I said, "But you meant to strike him." She started to speak, and for the first time her voice cracked. I was upset. I felt disrespected. I softened my tone, because this is where judges have to be careful. We can be firm without being cruel. I said, "Ma'am, everyone feels disrespected sometimes. Most people don't hit someone over it. The question is, what do you do when you're upset?" I gave her a moment. Is there anything you'd like to say to the officer? She hesitated, then said, I'm sorry you took it that way. I shook my head. No, that's not an apology. An apology is taking responsibility. Her attorney leaned in and whispered to her. She looked down. Then she said quietly, I'm sorry I hit you. I nodded. That's better. It's a start. And this is where my responsibility comes in. Because my job isn't simply to punish. My job is to protect the community and uphold the dignity of the court. And when someone assaults an officer in a courthouse, the court has to send a message, not out of anger, but out of necessity. I looked at her and said, Ma'am, you came in here today expecting that your status would insulate you from the consequences of your actions. That's not how justice works. I paused, and I could feel the courtroom quiet. I said, in this court, accountability is the great equalizer. I've been on this bench long enough to know that a sentence must match three things: the seriousness of the act, the need to deter future misconduct, and the possibility of rehabilitation. I took a breath and said, Ma'am, I'm going to speak plainly to you. I said, Miss, and then I corrected myself because this mattered. Ma'am, you may be someone's wife, but in this courtroom, you are your own person. Your actions are yours. Your consequences are yours. I continued, you struck a court officer in the performance of his duty. You disrupted proceedings. And afterward, you mocked the process publicly. You called it literally nothing. You called me dramatic. I paused. Let me tell you what's not nothing. A courthouse is a fragile place. It depends on people respecting boundaries. When someone crosses that boundary with violence, it threatens every person in this room. Then I laid out the sentence carefully, because realistic sentencing is not about theatrics. It's about structure. I said, here's what I'm ordering. First, you will receive a maximum allowable sentence within this court's authority for this charge, consistent with the statutory limits and your record. That includes a period of incarceration that reflects the seriousness of assaulting a court officer. Second, upon release, you will be placed on supervised probation with strict conditions: no contact with the officer except through counsel, compliance with all court orders, and immediate reporting of any new arrests. Third, you will complete anger management counseling and a court-approved accountability program, and you will provide proof of completion to this court. Fourth, you will perform community service in an environment where you are not treated as special, an assignment approved by probation, so you can spend time in a place where people serve others quietly, without applause. Then I looked at her directly. I said, this sentence isn't about humiliation. It's about teaching you what you should have learned long ago. You don't get to hurt people and then laugh it off. I added one more thing because I meant it. I said, I want you to understand something. You came in here thinking power is the ability to avoid consequences. Real power is the ability to control yourself. I could see it finally landing, not fully, but enough. Her shoulders dropped, her eyes filled. I said gently, I don't hate you. I don't even know you, but I expect better from you. And I hope you use this experience to become someone your family can be proud of, not because of money, but because of character. After I delivered the sentence, the courtroom did what courtrooms often do. It exhaled. You could feel a shift, like everyone was reminded that the rules still mean something. The officer sat back down, and he looked relieved, not triumphant, not gloating, just relieved. That matters. Because good officers don't want revenge. They want safety and respect. The defendant, who had been so composed, started to cry. Quietly at first, then with real emotion. I've seen tears that are performances. This didn't feel like that. It felt like someone realizing for the first time that the world does not rearrange itself around her. And I don't take pleasure in that. Let me be clear. I never enjoy watching someone's life get harder, but I do believe that sometimes reality is the only teacher left. After court, I spoke with my staff. I told them we did what we had to do. I also told them something I've said for years. The courthouse must remain a place where the powerless can stand safely in front of the powerful. Later, the clip of the ruling spread online. People praised it, criticized it, argued about it, like they always do. But I didn't sentence her for the comments, and I didn't sentence her to satisfy strangers. I sentenced her because assaulting a court officer is a line we cannot allow anyone to cross. And I hoped, sincerely, that she would take that lesson and change. Because if she didn't, the next lesson life gives might be much harsher than anything I can impose. Let me tell you what I hope people learn from this case. First, respect is not optional. It's the foundation of every peaceful interaction we have with strangers. When you remove respect, everything becomes a fight. Second, social media doesn't erase consequences. Posting, mocking, laughing, none of it changes what happened. If anything, it reveals your character faster than words ever could. And third, the courthouse must be protected, not for judges, not for lawyers, for the public, for the people who come in scared and need a fair hearing. In my 40 years on the bench, I've learned that justice isn't just a verdict, it's a lesson, sometimes gentle, sometimes firm, but always necessary. That's what I still believe, and that's why this case stayed with me.